As we continue looking at developmental psychology, this current lecture is going to be focusing on moral development. Moral development really represents the place in which a child's cognitive development intersects with his or her social world. We're going to be talking about another model. We previously talked about Piaget's model of cognitive development, and now we're going to talk about Kohlberg's model of moral development, which is very much related to Piaget's model. On the next slide, we're going to look at a few different models, just an overview of the various models, just to help you keep it straight. So go on to the next slide. In Piaget's model, we saw there were 4 stages of cognitive development. In this lecture, we're going to look at the theory of Lawrence Kohlberg, and it contains 3 stages, all of them having to do with the development of morality. In the next lecture, we'll be looking at Erik Erikson's stages. His model included 8 stages across the entire life, and he called it psychosocial development, and I think you'll enjoy that as well. Next slide. To begin with, here's a question to consider. Who do you think has the most influence on a teenager's moral beliefs? Do you think it's their parents? Could it be their peers or somebody else? Usually, the majority of students will say parents have the most influence on a teenager's moral beliefs because the parent has been there throughout the child's life, influencing the child, encouraging the child to believe certain ways and to not believe other things, punishing the child for what would be inappropriate behavior, and hopefully reinforcing the child for what's appropriate behavior. However, some students point out that once a child reaches the teenage years, he or she can be rebellious and maybe needs to break away from the parents. And that's a good point. We'll see later on that one of the parts of being a teenager is breaking away and forming one's own identity. So other students will say, no, the peers have the most influence at this point. The parents aren't particularly interesting or cool, and so the peers who are more interesting and cool and who the teenager wants the approval of are the ones who are going to have a greater influence on the teen's moral beliefs. But some people will say, well, there's other things as well. Television may have the greatest influence on a teenager's moral beliefs, depending on how much they watch. So we've got a variety of different influences on our morality to consider. We're going to go on and look at a model of how we develop a sense of morality. Next slide. Lawrence Kohlberg was a psychologist who was quite influenced by Jean Piaget, and he developed a theory of how it is that we learn what's right and wrong. And Kohlberg proposed that our reasoning about right and wrong, that is our moral reasoning, changes over time depending on our cognitive abilities. So early on, for example, in Piaget's sensory motor stage, we're probably not going to see much evidence of morality at all because the cognitive development is very simplistic at that point. As we develop, though, through the pre-operational, operational, and formal operational stages, we would expect that the moral reasoning would become more complex. Kohlberg studied moral development by using moral dilemma stories. That is, for people of a variety of ages, he read them stories and had them tell what they thought about what was right and what was wrong. And then Kohlberg analyzed the responses. So one of the more famous stories was called the Heinz Dilemma. And the story about Heinz was that Heinz's wife was dying from a rare form of cancer, and Heinz wanted to get medication to help her, to keep her from dying. And there was a pharmacist who had developed some drugs that would successfully treat this kind of cancer. However, these drugs were very expensive, so Kohlberg went to the pharmacist and asked, could I get some of the drugs from you, and I can't afford to pay for it all right now, but I could pay you over time for the drugs, and I will pay you off. And the pharmacist said, no, it's my special formulation. I developed the drug, and I'm going to make money from it. So no, I'm not going to sell it to you cheap or give you a payment plan. And so Hines later went back when the pharmacist wasn't there and broke in and stole the drugs and gave them to his wife to help her get better. Now, is this wrong or right for Hines to do this? That's the moral dilemma that Kohlberg, or one of the moral dilemmas that Kohlberg posed to his the people who he was studying, who were of various ages. And what he found were that people of various ages responded differently in terms of what they thought should have happened. So let's go ahead and look at the stages that Kohlberg found. Next slide. The first stage of moral reasoning, according to Kohlberg, is pre-conventional morality. And I kind of think of this as dog morality. If you don't allow your dog on the couch at home or on the furniture, the dog's going to stay off of the furniture while you're at home, right? But what if you go somewhere? You leave, you come home, you open the door. What's the first sound you hear? The sound of the dog's feet hitting the floor because it's been sleeping up on the couch. Why is this? Because you weren't around, and if the dog couldn't get punished, then it must have been okay to be up on the couch. But if you're around, the dog knows it could get punished. It stays off the couch. This is dog morality. Really, this is the essence of the first stage, that is pre-conventional morality. Before age 9, Kohlberg found that overall, morality seemed to be about avoiding punishment and getting rewards. So for the child who's fairly young, morality really means reward and punishment. Something is good if it's something that gets rewarded. It's bad if it's something that gets punished. So how do we know that speeding is bad? Speeding in a car? Because it gets punished. How do we know that studying for tests is good? It's good because it gets rewarded with a good grade. This is fairly simplistic morality that occurs during childhood. After age 9, Kohlberg found a second stage, a second type of reasoning about morality. Next slide. Look at this. A whole set of rules about the pool. Have you seen this sort of thing? Of course you have. You go to a pool, and before you go in, you see all these rules that say don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do the other thing. Pool rules morality is kind of like what I think of when I think of Kohlberg's second stage of morality. Next slide. This second stage Kohlberg called conventional morality. He said conventional morality, it starts occurring and around age 9 and occurs throughout adolescence. And in this point, people say we have to obey the rules because they're rules. Not necessarily because we'll get punished or rewarded, but the reason you obey rules is because they're rules. And if we don't obey rules, the current social structure will fall apart. So what would happen to our society if we didn't have rules or didn't have laws? Well, looking at the bottom, what would happen in our society? We'd see that people would speed and people might be in accidents. So here's a question that you might consider for yourself. Should you speed during a medical emergency? Well, on the one hand, you've got the idea that during a medical emergency you want to be able to help someone and save their life. But on the other hand, speeding is an illegal activity. Kohlberg would argue that in the second stage, that stage of conventional morality, the child would say you should not speed during a medical emergency. Why? Because rules are rules, and we have speed limits for a specific purpose. So you need to obey the speed limit, because if you don't, the current social structure will be falling apart. Now, if you said in this case, I would speed because it's important to save the life of the person I'm getting to the hospital, you're probably functioning at what Kohlberg would say is the third stage of morality. So let's go on to the next slide. Take a good look at this picture. This is a painting by Norman Rockwell from a magazine cover. What's the idea here? The idea is definitely a sort of morality that goes beyond simple rules about what's legal and what's not, and comes to a higher level of morality. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is straight from the Bible, the words of Jesus, although it's Jesus has been taken out of it in our modern language and we just call it the Golden Rule. But the idea here is that as we look at all of these people, we see that all of them are people, and all of them deserve the respect and treatment that we ourselves would like to have. This is a higher level moral principle, and it takes us to the next stage of Kohlberg's morality. Go on to the next slide. This third and final stage of Kohlberg's morality is he called post-conventional morality. Now, post-conventional morality, according to Kohlberg, can occur past adolescence and into adulthood. But there's a question mark there, because Kohlberg found that not all people functioned at this stage of morality, that there were plenty of adults who functioned at the conventional stage of morality, that is, they were rule-bound in their morality. Post-conventional morality involves following more general ethical principles, such as doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, rather than just following rules. So we're following general ethical principles, and morality equals or is affirming basic agreed upon rights of all people. So for example, the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to be able to speak your mind. All of these are things that would be considered agreed upon rights that all people should have. And this is what morality means in the post-conventional sense. We're going to try to apply Kohlberg's model of pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional morality in just a minute. Go on to the next slide. Here's a quiz for you. What level of moral development do you see here? Jesus went into a synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, the religious leaders asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Jesus said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So the man stretched it out and was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the religious leaders went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. My question for you is, what moral level was Jesus operating on, considering Kohlberg's stages? If you said stage 3, that is, post-conventional morality, you're correct. He's talking about law having to do with doing good and saving rather than discarding life. What about the religious leaders? What moral level were they operating on? If you said stage 2, conventional morality, you're correct. What they care about is obeying the law, and they're furious when the specific written letter of the law is not being obeyed. Next. Does Kohlberg's theory apply to everybody? There has been criticism of Kohlberg's model of moral development. A psychologist by the name of Carol Gilligan came up with the idea that maybe Kohlberg's model doesn't apply to females. She claimed that this model is biased against females because females don't necessarily have the same opportunities as males do in American society. Now, Gilligan was a feminist, and so she was reacting against this male-developed theory. However, the research support has not fallen in the direction of Carol Gilligan's arguments. Actually, it's been found that Kohlberg's theory applies equally well to males as it does to females. But what about this second charge, which is a little more serious? Does Kohlberg's theory apply to individualistic cultures but not to collectivistic cultures? Individualistic cultures are cultures in which we focus on the good of the individual person and the abilities of the individual. American culture, Western European culture are individualistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures are those in which the greatest good is not of the individual, but the greatest good is the good of the community. And so there's less of an emphasis on people becoming their own individual person and developing their own likes and dislikes and their own unique personality, but rather the emphasis is on the person fitting in and becoming a cog in the whole machine of society. Eastern cultures, Oriental cultures, and South American and Central American cultures often are more collectivistic, with a focus on society as a whole and the good of society as a whole as being morality. There is some legitimacy to this criticism. Kohlberg's theory does seem to focus more on individualistic cultures, and it seems to be less applicable to cultures in which the focus is on the greater good of the society. This brings us to the end of the lecture on morality, the development of morality. The next lecture will focus on changes across the entire lifespan and the theory of Erik Erikson. Next, or end of lecture.